key developments to emerge from the Arab Spring has been the use of activists, by activists, of social media to spread revolt and bring it to the attention of the outside world. From Tunisia to Egypt to Syria, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube have allowed protesters to organise and indeed televise their attempts to bring about regime change. But is the impact of social media on the wane? And are the very governments which were once at risk from it now beginning to harness its power to neutralise their opponents? David Thompson reports.
These days, revolutions are televised, and none more so than the Arab Spring, but not so much by professional correspondents as by images taken on mobile phones by activists who use social media to spread revolt.
These are some of those activists talking to me directly from Syria and Beirut via Skype.
The Syrian revolution will not, wouldn't happen without Facebook.
We could transfer the image on the ground inside a very tiny village in the countryside of Idlib.
Facebook have played a very good turn in Syrian revolution, as Facebook, and Twitter also.
What we've seen is protesters being able to use social media to mobilise, but then also film footage which gets picked up by TV stations, Al Jazeera, BBC and so on, and that then gets broadcast back to the countries, adding further weight to the protests.
One of the key players in doing just that has been the campaigning organisation Avaaz. They've helped get footage shot by protesters onto mainstream TV channels. But they're also keenly aware that if activists want to use social media as a weapon, so do the governments they're trying to overthrow.
There's an arms race between regimes and activists. Both of them are trying to outdo the other, whether it's regimes trying to listen in on what they're hearing, but also activists trying to increase their security and their ability to operate without being snooped on. We're aware of drones being used in Syria. We know the Iranians have given a lot of support to Assad. So doing this work securely has been one of the major challenges that many of the activists have faced.
In fact, some at the sharp end believe social media may be beginning to outlive its usefulness, at least in the Middle East.
I don't think that there is any way to use it in different or in more powerful way. Before we were using smartphone, now we are using HD cameras.
So where do social media and protest go next?
When we look to places like Africa, because their mobile phones and internet access via smartphones is spreading very, very quickly. So increasingly what we will see in the future is when there is unrest in Africa, when there are protests, when there are violent crackdowns, footage of what's happening will be immediately available internationally and across the country itself in a way that hasn't been the case in the past.
Social media didn't invent revolt, but it did bring it into our living rooms in almost real time. And that's a power both protesters and those they're trying to topple are desperate to harness.
That was David Thompson reporting. We're joined now by journalist Nabila Ramdani, who specialises in the Arab world, and John Kampfner, who campaigns on freedom of speech. And I think you're going to Egypt quite shortly.
Going to Tunisia.
To Tunisia.
And to Beirut as well.
OK, let me come to you first. Are we right to say, we remember in the early days of the Arab Spring, particularly out of Tahrir Square, but also in Tunisia, social media was being used by the insurgents as a way to get their story across in lands where the media were almost entirely controlled by the state. It's now right to say that the new governments are using social media to control what gets out?
Well, yes, absolutely, and there is no doubt that the social media was indeed a catalyst, especially at the start of the revolutions, and it actually played a pivotal role in effectively putting the problems of the Arab world on the global agenda. Having said that, it didn't quite lead to regime change. I think it would be naive to assume that.
It was a catalyst, as you say.
Absolutely, it was very much a powerful trigger, which was supported by traditional media. And we are seeing now regimes, especially in the rest of the Arab world, who are getting increasingly jittery about what's happened in the region, who are using social media to keep tabs on the activities of dissidents, political dissidents. So that's the case in the new Egypt, dare I say, where the new president is using Mubarak-era laws to crack down not only just on traditional media, but also on internet dissidents. in Gulf countries in particular, we have, very well-documented evidence of internet dissidents having been arrested, tortured, and indeed jailed. And these
in the Gulf?
In the Gulf, countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and even Qatar, for example. Interestingly, in Syria, where Facebook was banned before the revolution, it has then been allowed by the government in order to monitor the activities of dissidents. So we're seeing how governments use social media either to prevent dissent or indeed to put across their own messages.
It's depressing in a way, isn't it? Because we used to think, perhaps wrongly, naively, that social media, the internet, texting and all, they were kind of anarchic. Governments couldn't control them. They were the people's weapons of information. Turned out not to be true.
That was the great hope of the founders of the internet. It was originally called, if you remember, the Wild West. and now it's anything but. And it's not just, I mean, it's exactly right about the Middle East, but it's not just the Middle East. Everywhere. Russia in November introduced a pretty awful internet filtering law. And China sort of proselytizes as a sort of patriotic duty, this whole idea. And it's not just monitoring people, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, and it's not just monitoring what people write and what people say, it's also what's called deep packet inspection. It's actually going into people's computers, using technology to find out
what's there,
where they are, what they're doing.
Well, your whole life's on your computer.
No, absolutely. And as ever with these things, platforms are platforms. They don't, and they change behaviour through the communication. So the speed of communication has changed exponentially. Being able to get people out on the streets, you can do that just like this now, just as governments can get the security forces out on the streets. But I'm old enough to remember, as a young journalist, I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and I covered the end of communism in the Soviet Union and its constituent republics. There was none of this. There were faxes.
And mobile phones helped a bit too.
Well, there was even in those countries before that period. People still got out, but it was just much slower. So it doesn't change behaviour, but it does change the speed.
And dare I say, we're not just talking about authoritarian regimes. I mean, we have to be careful in any society. We've heard David Cameron, for example, during the riots, calling for Twitter and Facebook to be curtailed, which led to a very interesting...
And the police will be monitoring social media in the run-up to tomorrow's funeral, I assume?
You see, this is the issue. There are legitimate state, as offline as online, child pornography. Everybody says, yes, it's terrible, therefore we need to ban it and keep tabs on those doing it. Terrorism, as we were just discussing in the previous segment, copyright is a really interesting one. Governments, but what is happening, and you're absolutely right, it's not just authoritarians. In the UK, we saw off Theresa May's misguided communications data bill, which would have not just been extremely intrusive in terms of tracking people, and it's a fishing expedition. You don't just track bad people, you track everybody, just in the hope that you will find somebody. But it's not just bad of itself, but it also is carte blanche to the dictators.
Are we in a position yet? The Arab Spring is how old now? About 18 months? A lot more than that?
Yeah, more than 2 years
More
now,
than 2 years now. Are we in a position yet to say that in general, the governments that have replaced the previous governments are better or worse when it comes to this sort of thing?
Well, I think, transitions are always chaotic and can be extremely messy in certain instances.
You can go backwards.
And you can go backwards. I was quoting the example of Egypt, for example, where there is no question that I mean, how can you possibly go even further back than Mubarak? But there's no progress, for example.
There's no progress.
No progress. But interestingly, I just want to point out that the role that Google played in Egypt in particular when the internet has been shut down, it provided alternative services like Speak to Tweet, for example, where you could literally phone in your tweet and it could be picked up through without an internet connection needed. Are we going to see, the similar technology being provided to Saudi Arabia, for example?
Well, we shall see. It's interesting. It's worth keeping an eye on. Thank you for being with us.